maybe we can begin now. There might be more people joining us, but since it's 101, I'm gonna begin. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for our fourth Building Community Archives series. My name is Alejandra Lenes, and I'm the principal investigator of the Democratizing Racial Justice Project, and I'm also the chair of the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Texas in San Antonio. So the Democratizing Racial Justice Project, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, was envisioned by Dr. Jackie Cuevas with Dr. Rhonda Gonzalez and myself. It is a collaborative project among UTSA Women's Studies Institute and the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, Alamo Community Colleges, Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, and the Institute of Texan Cultures to engage in community-based endeavors to envision and realize racial justice. Through site-based collaborations, Democratizing Racial Justice elevates co-created community knowledge for just societies, transform access to the academy for people of color and first-generation students, and propagates transformative pedagogies in ethnic studies and the humanities. Democratizing Racial Justice, building on an established network of partners, brings together activists, scholars, students, and community members to formulate community-centric, ethical, collective research and imagine thriving futures where racial justice is possible. Democratizing Racial Justice seeks to transform the role of higher education, ethnic studies, and the humanities in particular, has in combating the erasure of people of color and their histories, and reimagining a society in which people are equally valued. So now if we can move to the next slide, I'm going to introduce our community guidelines. So first, some logistical agreement. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Please use the hand raise icon, and please share your preferred name and pronouns, and hold questions for the end of the session. Regarding our community agreements, speak from your own personal experiences using I statements, listen respectfully without interrupting, respect Black, Indigenous, people of color, respect all gender identities and expressions, and commit to dialogue rather than debate. So now I'm going to turn it to our co-principal investigator, Dr. Kirsten Gartner, who is going to introduce our speaker today and also moderate our session.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today. Before introducing Dr. Gould, please just do know if you're not following us on Instagram or social media, there are links and we'll put them in the chat also. But we try to share all our events with the community, so please follow us. Dr. Sarah Zenaida Gould is Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, MACRI, a national organization collecting and disseminating Mexican American civil rights history. She is a longtime public historian who has curated over a dozen exhibits on history, art, culture. She was formerly founding director of the Museo del West Side, and she was the lead curator researcher at the Institute of Texan Cultures. She received a BA in American Studies from Smith College, an MA and a PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan. She's a former fellow at the National Museum of American History, the Winterthur Museum, and the American Antiquarian Society. And she's also been an incredible colleague and friend to us during this first year of our Democratizing Racial Justice project. So thank you, Sarah. You've been delightful to work with. We really appreciate it. So as we wrap up this series today, and I just want to kind of highlight, this has been a 4-part series that we have recorded and we will put on our portal so you can refer to it at any time. And we wanted to introduce the idea of community archives, and we will continue that conversation in the next 2 years. So what we want to do today is I'll chat with Dr. Gould, first reviewing some of the key concepts about starting community archives. Then we're really going to ask her for advice and leading us forward on our project and maybe sharing some insights she learned from the blueprint with MACRI. And then finally, I think all of us together can kind of think about next year, particularly if we get the opportunity to meet face to face, ways that we can continue this conversation and maybe practice some of these ideas together. So let me get the conversation started. And by way of introduction, my name is Kirsten Gartner, and I am Associate Professor of History here at UTSA, and as Dr. Elenas noted, co-PI on the Democratizing Racial Justice project. So Dr. Gould, if we can start the conversation by returning to some key decisions when any of us begin the project of archiving or collecting or framing something we're committed to. Some of the key concepts you've talked about have included thinking about digital versus material artifacts, thinking about how much space you have and when and how you have access to those spaces. And I'll bring up some other topics that you've addressed, but I really just want to open the window to you beginning the conversation about here are some key things to think about on day one, which you might not think about till day 10, but if you haven't begun yet, what would you recommend beginning with?
You want to think about, based on whatever the topic of this community archive is, as well as who the community behind the community archive is, what is going to make more sense? A digital archive, which could be basically gathering digital files, JPEGs, TIFF files, image files, PDFs, document files, which you probably would want to save as PDFs just because that software is a little more portable, and then making those accessible to the different people who might be interested in accessing this. That's one idea, right? Digital. Another idea is, we know there are all of these papers, photographs, ephemera related to this topic that we're creating an archive on, and those things are scattered around. They don't have a safe home. Let's gather those physical artifacts and put them together into an archive. That's sort of a physical archive. And then maybe even there's a third idea of, well, we have some physical things, but then there are also, like, for example, let's say you're trying to create a family archive, let's say, and in your family there are things like physical photographs, maybe wedding certificates, or programs from funerals, things like that. But then also everybody in the family's got a ton of pictures on their cell phones, right? So maybe what you want to do is pursue a kind of a hybrid thing where you ask members of your family, go through your phones, find the photos that you want to put into this, email all of those in, full size, because you know how when you email a photo, it'll ask you, do you want it small, medium, large, full size, and we'll put them all into, say, this Google Drive, where we'll be gathering all of the digital things. But then meanwhile, if there are physical things that we want to have together for this archive, then we'll also gather all of those things. So it might be hybrid, but you want to think about, well, again, who is our audience for this? Because if your family is all in San Antonio, then it might make sense for it to be physical, or kind of physical and digital. But if your family is scattered across, multiple continents, it might make more sense for it to really just be digital. So because if that's the core audience for it. Now, having said that, maybe this is a community archive around, let's say, UTSA alumni. And so UTSA alumni are all over the place, but I suspect there's a heavy concentration of them in the South Texas, San Antonio area. And so maybe that would be more of a hybrid concept where we've got stuff online, but there's also this physical place. And periodically we have sort of history harvest days in San Antonio, or maybe even history harvest days in Austin for those people who have moved farther away, something like that. But then there would be a combination, right? So you want to just think about who is our community and what would be easiest for them to participate in this, and then who is our audience, and what is going to be the easiest way to connect with our audience. It may be very much that your community and your audience are more or less the same, but it may not be. So think about that, because it's going to impact your access issues. The other thing though is space. If you know there are, let's go back to the idea of a family archive. Different family members have different material objects, but you have family in San Antonio and in California, and maybe even you have some cousins in Canada or something. If you wanted to try to figure out, well, where's all this stuff staying? Sometimes in families in particular, you have a family member who's kind of like the family keeper, the family historian, but maybe that's not the case anymore. Maybe that person has passed away. Maybe you've got multiple people in the family who got a lot of stuff. It might make sense in that case for you to think about, again, digital, and then you could create a Google Drive that the whole family has access to. And then that way, all you're thinking about is that space where you've got everything cataloged. Having said that, if you have a ton of stuff in there, there is a certain cap where you go over the free amount for a Google Drive. And so then there's like, you can continue to pay for it. It's not very expensive, but just know that most things do have a cost, whether you're talking about physical space or digital space. Most things have a cost. So if you don't have that much stuff, you can probably figure out a relatively inexpensive way to do this, possibly even free. If you're doing a lot of physical stuff, last week I showed you an example of an acid-free file box and acid-free file folders. If you're doing physical, you're going to want to get things like that. And, you know, like one of those boxes is around $20. Now, if you buy them at volume, you can get a discount, but I don't know how many you need. But just think, you know, these things are not exactly free. And so there's a cost associated with it. So do you have the space to store all of those boxes? Do you have, is it easier for you to get access to digital space? For the items that you're wanting to collect, does it make sense to save those as digital files? Or are you in fact wanting to preserve physical things, and how are you going to do that? So you want to sort of figure that out. And I really think that it ultimately goes back to audience and what's going to be the best way for whoever your audience is to get access. So it could be digital, but it might just be, especially if it's a family archive and you have a family tradition of like a annual reunion. Reunion time might be the time that that archive comes out and that people add to it, and maybe even spend some time helping go through things and label things so that you can make sure everything is identified. That could be a great project for a family that's into that sort of thing. But then you just want to make sure you've got the right tools that you are going to need. You can get the basics, as I mentioned last week, the basic stuff that you can buy at the Container Store. You can certainly order it online from one of the many companies that creates archival materials, Gaylord, University Products. There's a number of different companies out there that do that. And then I guess just the one other thing to consider is the cost, because digital space is not terribly expensive, but if you want to sort of go beyond having a Google sheet where you're cataloging all of the things, if you want to, you know, sort of step it up to something that's really designed for collections management, those are not necessarily cheap. So your project, I mean, a community project can be of many different sizes. It can be truly just grassroots, using as many free online resources as you can get, or it can be much more involved. And so at that point, you might even think, we need to apply for a grant to help us pay for this sort of thing. And if you're based in Texas, a good place to look would be Humanities Texas. They have grants that range from like $2,500 to $5,000 and up. For if I'm thinking, if it's sort of you're a community archive that's growing and now you just need a little bit extra help and you need to maybe buy that software program, if you have a humanities expert consulting on your project, the Humanities Texas requires you to have somebody with at least a master's degree in humanities who's somehow involved in the project. And it might actually be very helpful to you to have a consultant anyway. But then you can apply for those grants, and they're pretty easy to apply to. Like the form is not complicated. So that would be a good place to look if you're in Texas. If you're not in Texas, more or less the same thing can be found in other states through whatever that state humanities council is. So Humanities Texas is basically our state agency for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and every state has one. So that's a good place to look. But yeah, I think, you know, you want to think about who's our audience, what scale are we talking about for this project? Because maybe it is something you can do sort of on a shoestring, at least to start. And then as it grows, then you can start looking for additional help. But digital, physical, hybrid, those are questions you want to answer pretty quickly once you start.
That's super helpful. And I think, you know, hearing what you're saying leads me to the next question, which is, you know, we've kind of envisioned a leader of any archival project. And then you just mentioned a consultant. And I wonder, and I know there's not one magic answer here or one recipe, but I wonder if you could say a few things about creating an archival team, if you will, or if you're working as an individual, when and who you might call on for help. But I imagine there's some finessing that needs to go on in terms of, you know, one person who ultimately may or may not make decisions for the collection, or times when people might disagree on the scope of the project, or how much money they want to invest in it. So could we ask you just to say a little bit about envisioning a project, the people involved in any, and again, knowing that this is a very complicated question and we have a limited amount of time, but any pointers to thinking about building that team?
I think that you want to, you know, I think the best way to get started, to start on the right foot, you want to be as inclusive as you can in this project. So for example, let's say you want to create a community archive about the, let's say the history of nightclubs on St. Mary's Street, something like that. Okay, well, you're going to want to find some people from different generations, because the history of clubs on St. Mary's Street is not just a 2021 thing, right? This goes back for at least a couple of decades. So if you can find some people who have knowledge of different time periods along the strip, that will be helpful, right? And so if automatically that makes you think, oh, but I don't really care that much, or I don't feel comfortable including the 1980s or something like that. Okay, that's a good clue there, that you in fact are wanting to squeeze in your scope a little bit more. That's okay, but just be intentional about it, right? And say our scope is whatever that is. And then you want to try to identify team members who can help you find the things to fill that scope. So the community and the concept of community archive is kind of telling us we need to be a little open to multiple perspectives here, because generally you're never going to find a community that's all of the exact same opinion and, you know, social single-mindedness, right? So that right there is, I guess, something just to consider, that this, if you're going to do this community archive, you need to be ready to hear different opinions, and it's not necessarily always going to be really clear we're going to do step A and then step B, because you might have people on the team who say, well, what about this other thing? And so then you say, okay, then there's a step A and a half, you know, something like that. So and that's okay. People who do community work, community history probably already know this, but the kind of work that we do is just a little bit slower. And it's because of the time that is required to hear everybody's opinions and ideas and work those into the project. So the work that we do is just slower. If you wanted to do something by yourself, you could probably do it a lot faster. But when you do it by yourself, you just don't get as many perspectives, and you probably, ideas that never would have occurred to you, just they never pop up, right? So sometimes by doing a community project, you get a much fuller story, but it's a slower process. So I think you just have to sort of be open to that and be patient. But yeah, you want to have, if you know this person is going to have a lot of stories, a lot of information, a lot of contacts, try to get them on your team. When you talk to any new team member, ask them, who else should I be talking to? Who else should we be trying to get onto the team? Because they may know other people. Once you've got what seems like your team together, you may find that some members just aren't as committed to, say, meeting every week or doing little tasks. That doesn't mean you kick them out of the team, but I just think you need to sort of have expectations that understand that different humans have different capacities, whether just based on what else is on their plate, but also just how interested they may be. Some people may be extremely interested in the project. Some people may be more, sort of in the middle, like, yeah, I want to be part of the project. I'm interested, but I've got other things too. And then there may be some people who have just a lower level of interest, and yet that one thing that they do for you for the project is so helpful and so critical to its success. So, just again, be open to, when you're doing community work, you have different people who kind of plug in at different levels. And depending on what's going on in their life, there might be some weeks when they're super engaged, and there might be some weeks when you can't get a hold of them. And it's just because, life. So that's just something to keep in mind about community projects, is it's generally not the same as like when you're at work. Like when you're at work and it's like everybody's expected to, be there from starting time to ending time. Community projects are just not like that. So patience, and but make sure you've covered all your bases in terms of who would know. If your scope covers a couple of decades, you want to make sure you've got people with expertise in the more recent time as well as the beginning period that you're looking at. This is something that comes up a lot in critiques of not only history and public history, but pretty much everything, is, were you intentional in trying to make sure that diverse voices were included, right? Now, it's possible that the project you're working on is a project that was, maybe it's a community history of some women's club. Well, then probably most of the people who are involved on the team are women, right? But who knows? There may have in fact been some man who was the one who made sure that they got a lease for their meeting space or something like that. Who knows? But just make sure that if it seems like all the members of your team kind of look alike, is that because that is in fact representative of who's behind this thing that you're trying to archive, or in fact, is that more a reflection of your own social circle? And so, who have you not invited to the table? So you want to be conscious of that, right? You want to make sure you've included multiple voices who have a stake in whatever this is. Actually, that's a good thing to think about. Who has a stake in this, and are they present? Let's see. Some people might tell you don't have more than so many, X number of people on the committee, because if you have 25 people, you're never going to be able to get everybody together at the same time. I would kind of tell you that's true, even if it's a group of 3. You may not always be able to get all 3 people together all the time. So it's true, if you're going to have a group of 25, and you are planning to do your meetings in person, it might be a little trickier to find a place for the 25 of you to meet. Whereas if there's only 3 of you, you could meet at Starbucks or something. But I don't know. I wouldn't be too afraid of inviting too many people. For community work, again, you're going to have different people with different levels of free time and availability. So in a way, I would sort of say the more the merrier. but I mean, your mileage may vary on that.
Great. All right, so now I'm going to transition to really get your insight on a project that we're working on, and maybe ask you to illustrate a bit with the project that you're working on. So as you know, the Democratizing Racial Justice project is a 3-year project, and we do want to share everything with a very broad community. So in terms of our archival project, all of your questions are resonating in terms of thinking about our scope, our timeline, and whatnot. But any tips you might have for being, I like your word, intentional and deliberate, not only in terms of what we're collecting, but how we might present that. And we're really thinking of much more of a digital presentation. And then piggybacking on that a little bit, I know you spent a lot of time on careful planning for MACRI and creating a blueprint. And could you share a little bit of that with us as well, perhaps as an illustrative example as we begin to build and share our archive?
Yeah. One of the things that I was concerned about when we decided we're going to build this archive around Mexican American civil rights history, I wanted to be careful that we weren't reinventing the wheel, that we weren't doing anything to step on the toes of people before us who have been working to collect and gather Mexican American civil rights history archival materials. And I wanted to make sure that we took the opportunity to identify and acknowledge the work that other people have done. Sometimes when something is outside of our exact experience, we might be tempted to say, well, nobody does blah blah blah, or nobody pays attention to this topic. But maybe it's just that we haven't done a deep enough dive to discover what in fact people have already done. And in my case, I actually knew that people had been doing this on their own, in various pockets around the country. And so I just didn't, I would never want any of those people to feel sort of, slighted, like, hey, I've been doing this, over here in my corner for the last 10 years, right? And so so that was just part 1, I guess. Part 2 is that we wanted to make sure that whatever we did was really accessible to the public, because at least in what I knew of Mexican American civil rights archival materials that were out there that are being collected, they were almost exclusively at universities, which is great. But I think that for the general public doesn't necessarily have a strong understanding of how you search a university's special collections, either online or physically show up and get to look at stuff. And so I wanted to make sure that whatever we were doing was kind of bridging that gap so that we could be very public facing and think of our core audience not necessarily as researchers. Young researchers maybe is what we're going after, like students, like K through 12, as well as college students. But you don't need to be writing a book. That was my idea, that you don't need to be writing a book to be able to figure out how to access whatever our archive would be. So what we started doing as part of this blueprint project was meeting with people who have been collecting Mexican American civil rights history archival documents at universities around the country, hearing, how much are we talking about? Like, what are the linear footage of what you've got that's related to Mexican American civil rights history? And of that, is it mostly digitized, mostly not? Are there things that you wish you could bring into your collection, but it just hasn't happened yet? Are there other collections that you know about that we should know about? So doing these conversations with people, as well as, in addition to those university folks, also talking to individuals who have things in their own homes or in their family. For a variety of reasons, there are some people who don't want to give their things to a university. And it may just be that they just don't want to give it away, period, because they want to keep it in the family, which is very understandable, right? I think particularly for people of color, holding on to material possessions over multiple generations is hard. And I mean, it's hard for anybody, just because people move, stuff takes up space, and not all of us have extra closet space or stuff like that. So, but I think particularly for people of color, when we're talking about, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, working class people for whom extra space is just not a reality, and for whom just the cost of maintaining and keeping things is often prohibitive, and so then a lot of things get lost or discarded. What you do manage to hold on to becomes extremely precious. So some people, they just don't want to give up those things, and it's totally understandable. And then for other folks, there may be some suspicion around institutions, and, well, what are they going to do with this if we give it to them? And then I'll tell you that this isn't always the case, but it's not unusual for things to go into an institutional repository. And then, because that institutional repository is trying to follow best practices to safeguard that thing, they don't make it terribly easy to see. In some cases, now, if they have a lot of money and they've digitized everything, well, then maybe it's on the internet. But digitizing costs money, and so everybody has a backlog of things that they want to get digitized, but they haven't been digitized yet. Everybody has a backlog, and this is just speculation on my point, okay? But I suspect that some things that are related to Mexican American history that have been sitting in repositories undigitized for a long time are there because they're not seen as high priority. So that some things that are donated to that archive get digitized faster because they're seen as high priority. And again, this is just me and my suspicion. I don't have proof, but I think that oftentimes things connected to, I'm kind of just basing this on how many things that I know are in institutional archives and have been there for a long time and haven't been digitized. But again, I just want to make sure everybody knows, everybody has a backlog. So, we can't give them too much grief about it, because again, it costs staff time and it costs actual money to digitize things. So that's a reality. So for the blueprint, we've been interviewing institutions, individuals, trying to find out what stuff is out there, what stuff is digitized, what stuff is not digitized. If it were, and then we're also asking, if it were digitized, what are examples of archive portals? So like online archives where you can search and find things. What are examples that you find particularly user-friendly? And then we've been throwing up some examples on the screen. We've been doing all of this by Zoom. throwing up examples on the screen and asking for feedback on different types of portals, because there's all different kinds of ways that you can interface with digital archives. And, you know, if you are a university researcher, you're probably very familiar with how to navigate library catalogs and like WorldCat and things like that. And so you might be very, you know, attuned to how to search for things and find them. But not everybody has that skill set. So, I mean, on the one hand, that's something that we can be educating the public around, you know, how to do a really effective web search, how to do an effective search of a library catalog or an archive catalog. But I also just think, you know, some digital interfaces are a lot more user friendly than others. So we've been just trying to get examples of what works for different people. And so it's sort of like a survey, right? And that survey is helping us decide what our portal will actually look like. And it's also helping us identify some potential partners. So I've mentioned this before, but I'll bring it up again. For us, what we've figured out is that we don't want to be the permanent repository for tens of thousands of things, because we understand that repositories all over the country have been collecting in the same area that we're interested in. They've already got this stuff. They've already got the infrastructure. In some cases, some of that stuff has been digitized. We know a lot of it hasn't. But if we can help them financially digitize things that they already have that are connected to our mission, and then in exchange, they let us put links to that stuff in our portal, you know, then that helps increase access to those things that they already have. Maybe it helps increase awareness of those repositories to a general public that's interested in Mexican American civil rights history. But also then we can do the same thing for families. So families can keep their stuff, but we digitize it. We put it in the portal. There's no exchange of items though, right? So they get to keep everything. But we just have that digital copy in the portal. And then, you know, again, imagine a pie chart, and just one small slice would be stuff that people actually like physically donate to us. And then we would own that, but also put the digital in our portal. But I prefer just honestly, I think it's better for us if the actual physical things, for the most part, stay somewhere else, because space is very expensive. And again, I'm very sensitive to the idea that if a family wants to hold on to records that they have, I want them to hold on to those records. And so, you know, if there's a way for us to help them, for example, like if they lend us some things that they have so we can scan them, and then when we give them back to the family, if we can have maybe rehoused them in an acid-free box so that they then get to keep it at home, but in a sort of a, you know, protective box, you know, then I hope we can do that. That would be ideal, I think. But yeah, so for us, the blueprint was all about just trying to figure out what are other people doing, and then what is the best path for us to take so that we're not stepping on anybody else's toes, so that we can acknowledge the work that other people are doing, but that we can maybe help bring some of that to a broader general public. Because I think, you know, university archives, their audience is people who are writing journal articles and books and things like that, which is all very important. But we're wanting to bring this information to, you know, now that we're getting ethnic studies at the K through 12 level, we're wanting to bring primary sources to that level, but also hoping that for people who retirees who are just, they are all over Facebook and the internet. Like, well, let's get them looking at some primary sources, because I think that for a lot of folks, like I'm just thinking about my parents, like they never got to take a Mexican American studies class, right? But that doesn't mean they're not interested. So yeah, we're thinking about those sorts of audiences, and then how can we work with established institutions, families, bring information to the public. Does that help?
That really helps, and I particularly love the way you the collaborative and cooperative impulse of everything that you're doing, that you can create these win-win scenarios. And I think that's really helpful to think about. Let me push you a little bit on a very practical issue. And you've mentioned this a bit, the rise of digital communication and where we put things. When we opened this program, we had our Instagram feed and our social media contacts. Do you have any tips for how we save that and preserve it and present it? And I know this is an ongoing conversation in the historical field, but it becomes less theoretical when you're trying to do it and much more complicated. So any thoughts you have on that would be really welcome.
Yeah, this is a very interesting area that it's still, I think that, I think the answer is we don't know yet. But what I will tell you is, if you're putting things on Instagram, if you're putting things on Facebook, and by putting things, I mean, like, let's say you created a graphic, or you just took a picture on your phone and then you put it on Instagram. I would say don't delete that picture from your phone thinking, oh, it's cool, it's on Instagram, because we don't know. Like in 5-10 years, Instagram might become paywalled. Like, oh, you want to get on Instagram? Okay, that's $9.99 a month, and maybe you don't want to do that. And so that doesn't mean you shouldn't use Instagram or Facebook, but it's just, I would also make sure you're saving whatever it is you're putting there somewhere else, because it may or may not be accessible to you down the road. There's this fantastic Instagram feed that I mentioned in the first session, Barrio ATX, and he posts old images from Austin and tells you a little bit about whatever that history is. It's really cool. It's like a little online archive of Mexican American Austin right there, easily for anybody to find on Instagram. It's very cool. I will just say, again, if Instagram decides to become paywalled, or I know this isn't going to happen, but let's just say the FCC shut down Instagram for some reason or another, there's not really a way to extract things easily from Instagram, because like once you put it there, I mean, they don't have the intellectual property rights to it, but they own the interface. And so if you may have encountered this, if you see something you like on Instagram or Facebook and you like try to save that image, you can, but the resolution is very low, because once you load it onto there, they shrink it so that it doesn't take up so much bandwidth and it'll load faster, right? But then if you try to reverse save it from there, the quality is very poor. So if you've got the original photo that you took with your smartphone camera, the resolution is going to be much higher than the version you load onto Facebook or Instagram. So that's just another reason to save your original. If you put something, an image with a little story, and then people started responding to it, and there was just this really great community conversation. I'm sorry, a big truck is driving by. Okay, but just imagine there was this really great community conversation that played out in the comments, and you want to capture that. I would, take screenshots of it and try to save it that way, because yeah, you just don't know if in the future that will still be easily accessible.
Yeah, that's so important. And one of the comments Jose said, it makes him think of MySpace and everything that was lost during an era when we couldn't imagine MySpace going away, and now it's gone. And I'm sure this is one of a dozen stories of digital technologies that have.
And I bet a lot of your students don't even know what that is.
This is a good point. We're aging ourselves by saying MySpace. At the risk of taking up too much time, I think I want to wrap up my questions for you so that the audience has time to ask questions. And I think one way to get this conversation started with the audience, of course, is to think about our programming for the next 2 years, because I think there is a groundswell of interest in this. And I think we've loved getting the conversation started online and being safe in the time of COVID-19, but we want to imagine ways in the next 2 years where maybe we could hold some workshops and, do things as simple as share acid-free boxes or have people bring in material and talk about digitizing, maybe have the tools for them or something. So let me invite you. None of this is a firm commitment. These are all ideas. But as you think about ways that we might get more creative in the next couple of years, what would you like to see? And then if I can ask all of you who are with us today to raise your hand or put in the chats if you have questions or ideas that would help you with projects that you're considering. So Sarah, would you get this conversation started?
Sure. Well, let me just point to, I see Dr. Hardgrove asked a question about what a history harvest is. So that's actually a good example of something that we could do together. So a history harvest goes by various names. Sometimes museums will call them scan days or something like that. But basically the idea is you come in, you bring in photographs, maybe whoever the host is might have sort of like a booth that they've set up where you can record an oral history. Maybe they've got another booth where they've got some scanners and so they can scan photographs. The Texas Archive of the Moving Image, TAMI, does harvest days where people bring in like video cassettes or home videos, and they can't process it right then and there because of the time involved in doing that. But they'll take your things and then I think they ship them back to you. But first they take down all the information, like when was this recorded, where, do you know who the people in it are, things like that. They try to get as much information out of you. But that's what it is. It's just a day where you invite the public to come and bring stuff, and then you try to have different stations to help go through what they've got. And a lot of times they're hosted by a museum or an archive, and the idea is that they'll add those things to their collection, but then give the stuff back to the family or whoever's brought it in. But yeah, I mean, one great thing that could be done at a history harvest, if you had enough money, because this is where it could get slightly expensive, is if folks brought things in, in cardboard shoe boxes, and maybe you could provide materials to rehouse them in something that's a little bit safer, a little more stable. But you just never know what they're going to bring you. So for example, some of you probably have family photo albums where back in the day when you first put the photos in there, the pages were kind of like sticky, like you peel off this clear plastic and then you put the photo and then you put the clear plastic back. Over time, that thing that was only slightly sticky has now probably become like hard as cement. And remember last week I told you about Post-its. The same things happens with Post-its. So those kind of photo albums, like you're not going to be able to just take the images out. In fact, I think a lot of people in just leaving the photos in there, maybe just scanning entire pages from within the book. But if talking to people about, okay, so this happened and that's fine. Just, keep this family photo album the way it is. Don't try to take the pictures out. But moving forward, here are some ideas for creating your future photo albums so that doesn't happen. Although the reality is so many people are only using their phones for their photos. And I'm sure some of you at this point have gone through several cell phones, smartphones. And so just, if you're good and remember to download your photos onto your computer on a regular basis, that's great. You really should do that. If you want to take it a step further, you can get those photos printed out. I know it seems like the totally archaic thing to do, but you can get them printed out. And the reality is those printed photos will probably last longer than your cell phone. So just keep that in mind.
Those are good tips, and we're getting some other good tips in the chat. So if everyone just take a moment before we finish this up to look at the chat. There are people making recommendations for crawling websites and the Wayback Machine and a Texas government site. But let me turn things over. If you would just raise your hand so we know that you want to give us an idea or ask a question. Anyone in the community today want to share in this conversation about thinking of events for next semester, or anything you want to ask about what we've discussed today?
I will just say I see a question about the Humanities Texas and a History Harvest Day. Absolutely. I think that would be a good candidate for one of those grants. And also, I thank you, Abra, for sharing that web recorder. I'm gonna have to check that out. I did just want to add one thing. In Tucson, there's this theater company called the Borderlands Theater. And a few years ago, they did a really cool project, which I'm surprised. I'm sure similar things have happened in other places, but I'm surprised I haven't seen more examples of it. But basically, what they did was they did a bunch of oral histories with people in a neighborhood in downtown Tucson that was wiped out when they built the freeway and the convention center. So they tore down this neighborhood and they tracked down people who, I think they did something on social media to say, did you live in that neighborhood? We're collecting oral histories. They collected a bunch of oral histories and then they turned it into a play, and it was amazing. But I mean, basically they were doing like History Harvest Days. All those oral histories, I believe, are at the university there now. And then they just created this like cultural production out of it. What's cool about that is, if you think about it, the audience who is going to go and listen to oral histories in an archive is somewhat limited, right? I mean, students, maybe if they're taking a class on this, might be told, oh, there's a collection of these oral histories in the archive, you can go and listen to them. Or, I don't know, other scholars might be interested in that. But the idea of then turning it into something that is very much for the general public, like a play, I love that idea, because you're taking sort of the raw materials of the history and then making them super accessible.
That is a really great suggestion. And I think I encourage everyone to sit on these thoughts and share them with us. You can email the DRJ, and I think we'd love to build out this archiving project in the next couple of years. And as we wrap this up, Dr. Gould, I just want to say what an inspiring partner you've been. I think you've taught us all a lot and encouraged us to save these histories and stories and to define community projects. It's much appreciated. I also just want to tell you some perspectives that I've heard from students who have attended, telling me stories that include family histories that are in boxes in their attic that they've never talked about with their parents. It's grandparents' papers and they've never talked about it, and they're now inspired to do it. So I think this has been really important. and then colleagues who are taking your ideas and putting them into the classroom. And just amongst ourselves, I think we have all just wanted to compliment you on how wonderful you are at taking really complicated and nuanced ideas that are in library science journals people are debating and making them accessible to all of us, no matter where we're coming from. So you've also been a model teacher throughout this, so we appreciate that as well. And we are really happy that we get to collaborate with you for 2 more years. So thank you for this series and for all of your contributions, and for all of you here today. Thank you for being here. We couldn't do this without you. We will be recording this series, and we've recorded the other 3, and we will share our portal with you as it becomes accessible. And you will certainly be the first people invited to our 2022 workshop. The date still TBD.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just say one thing? You just made me think of something. If you're going home for the holidays and this somehow inspires you to like pull out family photos, if you feel tempted to write on the back of a photo with a pen, please don't do that. Use a pencil and write lightly. So you don't want to press into that paper, right? You just want to lightly and pencil. But yeah, no pen. Okay.
That's a very good tip. I'm going to file that one away for life. Okay. All right. Well, have a great afternoon, everyone, and hope to see you soon. And thanks again, Dr. Gould.
Thanks. Bye-bye.